I was reading yesterday about the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was talking about the forthcoming wedding of Harry, and I can never remember her name. I never remember her name. Just as well I'm not Harry. And Justin Welby was saying that he has a great fear for the wedding, that he might drop the ring. Well, I thought that might be the least of the worries, I would have thought. And singing that song about to be in the moment, I guess at the wedding ceremony, the moment when everybody is transfixed is the time when one says to the other, will you take this woman for your lawly wedded wife, or your etc. And you wait for the I do. I don't know if anybody tenses, feeling somebody might jump up and shout something as a reason why the two should not marry. But this morning I'm going to make an announcement that I've never made before. I'm going to invite you to a wedding. Well, the wedding in John 2. Let me read you the words of John 2. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples had almost been invited to the wedding, they were invited, had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, she says, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He had not realized where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. And then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. This, the first of his miracle signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee, and he thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. I just thought I would say a little bit first about the wedding process in the time of Jesus, which is rather different than the way we do things. Marriage took place at a very young age. Most rabbis propose the age of 18 as the most appropriate for men, though often a bit younger, especially when war was less common. And young women married almost as soon as they were physically ready for marriage, approximately the age of 13 or 14. In most cases, marriages were arranged by the parents for their children. However, there were exceptions. Nevertheless, the insight in the ancient world, and even in many places today, was that marriage was not so much about love and romance as about survival. Further, it was not merely individuals who married, but families that came together in mutual support. Beauty and romance, while considered pleasant things, were also known to be passing, and life and survival had to be based on sturdier foundations. There was an enormous period. Weddings typically extended over a period of 5 to 7 days. Autumn was the best time for marriages. The harvest was in, the vintage over, minds were free, and hearts were at rest. At the beginning of the wedding feast, in the evening, the bridegroom, accompanied by his friends, went to fetch his betrothed from her father's house. He would wear particularly splendid clothing, sometimes even a crown. A procession was formed under the direction of one of the bridegroom's friends, who acted as the master of ceremonies, remained by his side throughout the rejoicing. The bride was carried in a litter and in procession. She was beautifully dressed. And along the way, people sang wedding songs that were traditionally known and largely drawn from the Song of Songs in the Bible, where it says in the Song of Songs, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness, like a column of smoke perfumed with myrrh and incense, made from all the spices of the merchant?" When the procession reached the bridegroom's house, his parents bestowed a traditional blessing drawn from Scripture and other sources. And after the prayers, the evening was passed in games and dancing, and the bridegroom took part in the festivities. But the bride withdrew with her bridesmaids and friends to another room assigned for her. The next day was the wedding feast, and once again there was a general rejoicing and a sort of holiday in the village. There was a meal toward the end of the day at which men and women were served separately. This was a time for the giving of presents. The bride, all dressed in white, was surrounded by her bridesmaids, usually 10 of them. And she sat under a canopy while traditional songs and blessings were sung and recited. And during this time in the evening, the groom arrived. And while the exact ritual words were not certain, there seems to have been a dialogue between bride and groom recorded in the Song of Songs. And the bride says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine." Wow. This is an amazing event at Cana in Galilee, a very small village. It meant that everybody was there. The whole community would have been part of the great celebration. This is one of 7 stories in John's Gospel which tell, and John is trying to tell his readers and people that this Jesus is indeed the Son of God. In the 7 signs you have the healing of a little boy, healing a man who had been paralyzed for 38 years, feeding of the 5,000, the walking on the water, healing a man born blind, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, all signs of God revealing his glory in Jesus Christ, that Christ is more than a great teacher or prophet, that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, the Son of God, that Jesus is indeed the Savior of the world. What's amazing to me about this particular chapter is that it comes between chapter 1 and chapter 3. And in chapter 1 of John's Gospel, you have some of the greatest statements made about faith. In the beginning was the Word, taking us back to Genesis, creation. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was with God, all things were made by him. And then begins that amazing procession of words, until you come to the great proclamation that the Word was made flesh, dwelt among us. And says the writer, we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten Son. And then if you go to chapter 3, you get some extraordinary words again, which after the story of Nicodemus, the man who came to Jesus, you get those great words of the gospel, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but shall have everlasting life. Here is the story in chapter 2, right in the middle of some of the greatest statements of the gospel. You have John explaining what the meaning and the coming of Christ means for humankind, that it is the greatest event in the world, that all roads lead to that event in understanding the history of the world as we do as Christians. And like I said, the great powerful words of John chapter 3. And yet in the middle of this, of the great and the big and the mighty statements, you have something which takes place, and takes place, and takes place. Nothing new, nothing different. A man and a woman coming together as husband and wife. there, in essence, if you like to put it in theological terms, is the truth of the incarnation, that God comes to us where we are, in the simplicities, in the ordinariness, in the celebrations, in the pains, the sufferings of human life. We go from the great statements in chapter 1 and chapter 3, and bang in the middle, as I keep saying this morning, is this story. John, in the gospel, is setting before us the great battle of big and small, the good and the bad, in the event of Jesus, the God who is the origin of all things, acting in a new way to redeem creation by a new act of creation, becoming flesh, and the shocking center of our faith, which dares to claim that in the fragility and the contingency of a single human life, the Creator knew his creation from the inside. John says he dwelt among us. And here in the second chapter of John's Gospel, we see how the good news of Jesus takes place where we are. In the events that often bind us together, the times that keep reminding us about life, about the future, seen in a bride and bridegroom, in the vows and commitments, in events captured or fleshed through song and music and dance, given uplift in prose and poetry to fit the occasion. I did have a note here about it's perhaps the wrong words, I think, in the end of the day. Well, they're not, in a way. It's often, as you sit around, people often think of the wrong hymns you can choose for your wedding, like Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, forgive us our foolish ways. Or Charles Wesley's hymn, Come O Thou Traveller Unknown. And I've got down, I tend to sing sometimes when I'm here these days, and I've got down, it is no secret what God can do. Well, I suppose some people occasionally think that when they go to somebody's wedding. It is no secret what God can do. Those two. Wow. Do you remember the song? It is no secret what God can do. Because the essence again in this story of John chapter 2, in this extraordinary miracle that takes place, of the water turned into wine, it is, in essence, it is the centrality of what the gospel is about. It is no secret what God can do if we believe. Well, here we are at this wedding. I've not been to too many weddings. They always seem to be events that are surrounded by all kinds of tensions, worries, and are things going to happen and everything else? And my memories of my mother inspecting me. Is the tie straight? Is the shirt clean? Did you bring your suit? Have you had your hair cut? The wedding. And at this wedding, the most embarrassing moment takes place, doesn't it? Can you imagine? In the time of Jesus, it was so important that there would be enough wine. So important. And they ran out of wine. Wow. What an embarrassing moment to be running out of the very thing. The bride and the bridegroom or the family must have thought, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Can you imagine they would have to live for months and months afterwards? People will be saying, did you go to so-and-so's wedding the other day? You never guess what happened. Well, what happened? They ran out of wine. They ran out of wine at their wedding. It's rather like having a little hole in your jersey, isn't it? Or the other day when I had when I had this, I ordered a cupboard from a company. And when it came, it had a little mark in the center. And I phoned up to say, hello. I said, in my cupboard, there's this long cupboard, there's a little mark in the center. And the John Lewis people said, well, would you like £50 less than what you're going to pay? And I said, no. I said, I want a new cupboard. Because I know that if I had taken that cupboard, people would say forever, what a lovely cupboard you have, Tony. What a pity you have a mark in the very center of the cupboard. And you can imagine here in this gossip and the conversation of this wedding, the very thing that's most important. I had a big do in London some years ago. My relations used to own the shop at the bottom of the bakers at the bottom of Tune Hill, the bottom of the hill in Newlyn. And I ordered 100 Cornish pasties for the big do. And the pasties were delivered the next day after the event. And we had no food. We had no food. See, the way you're reacting, that's what people would have been saying at this wedding. What are we going to do? Well, what is John trying to tell us? In the basic sense, there is something very basic going to take place in this situation because Jesus' mother has obviously been told by them. They obviously think she has influence. Mothers do have influence, so they tell me. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." There's a very strange expression that comes next, but it is in a way a sense of the language of the time. And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." She has faith. She has belief that at this moment, Jesus will come to the rescue of the situation, this dire moment. Now, John might be telling us, some of you may disagree with me, but John is, though he's narrating something that is happening, and a story that must have been so familiar because it's the kind of story you would remember, wouldn't you, at a particular moment like a wedding. But John obviously has a greater purpose. Right throughout his Gospels, the whole purpose is trying to tell us all the time that this Jesus is the one. This is God's Son. This is the one who has come into the world. The world is changed because of him, because of his life, because of his death. He will come again, but at this moment, John is trying to tell us, I think, that wherever you are in life, however the difficulties and the problems you find yourself in, that this story is to tell you in your brokenness and the brokenness of humanity, in the division of humanity, or humankind at war with itself, or where communities are split and asunder, that God can come into your situation. That God comes to you where you are at that moment in your life, if you will listen to him. John's testimony throughout his gospel is that Jesus can transform life, to make a change as great as turning water into wine. So it's not just a simple story. It's not just a story he's telling, a memory, a recollection, an amusing moment. It's something far more serious. It's more illustrative of the fact it is no secret. It is no secret what God can do. You know, in the Hebrew view of life is that every danger, every humiliation, every period of suffering is a time of opportunity. The deeper truth in biblical view of God's attempt to erect order out of disorder and frustration at the Tower of Babel is that God comes into human life and God comes into our life. And God will redeem our life and God will change our life. It is no secret what God can do. This, John says, is the first of his miraculous signs that Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. But of course there is the other one, which some of you smiled. People often think, well, is there humor in the Bible? Well, there is humor in this story because what happens is so true. People do, don't they? I have been to parties and groups, and just occasionally when I've been in a better frame of mind, I shouldn't say this as a Methodist, should I really, that I brought a bottle of wine. I shall be punished severely for this. But I have taken a really good bottle of wine. And I know what's going to happen. My bottle will be pushed aside. And the old cheapo stuff. You've been to so many parties where the wine is absolutely awful. And you say, what I do say nowadays is, if I ever get invited, which is not very often, to a party, I often say, I think I would like some of my own wine, please. And I love that little bit of humor, isn't it? Everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guest. Oh, no, it's the other way around, isn't it? Oh, my goodness, it's the other way around. Oh, a little bit of good wine first in this store. Oh, I've got it the wrong way around. Oh, a little bit of good wine first. And when everybody is sort of seemingly happy, then you bring out the cheaper wine. And I've known friends of mine who save up the good wine for their own use at another time. Everyone brings out the choice wine first. I must remember. Well, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. So what I'm saying very simply from this story, and there are many things which can be said from this story. What I'm trying to say, I suppose, in the end of the day, is that John, by wrapping this story between the first and the third chapters, he's made his great pronouncements about the truth and what the gospel is about. He is going to tell us in tremendous language to Nicodemus as he ends that third chapter. But chunk right in the middle is this story of Cana and Galilee, because it illustrates the becoming of flesh of God. God comes where we are. Hey, you don't have to invent some big special occasion. Where you find yourself in your life, where you are this morning, where you are in your thoughts, where you are in your life. Just welcome God into that moment, into that situation. And you may be surprised. When I was younger, we used to have testimonies, I remember. Powerful testimonies of people. We don't tend to have testimonies anymore, which is a great pity. People saying where they are in life and what God has done for them this week. I remember picking up a book by a man called Frank Jennings. It was then I began to realize that God does change human life. And some of the great figures of Christian history have been people who've realized that God can start with them and make them into something special. As God can come to you, and God can come to me, and God can make us something special. Each of us is approached with God in his love. Each of us, God comes to us. For each of us, Christ dies. That's today on this Passion Sunday as we march our way towards Palm Sunday and our journey to Good Friday, before we can rejoice that Christ is risen, that Christ is Lord. Shall we pray? God our Father, you come to us. You come to us in our lives. You come to us where we are. You bring the goodness of your love to us. You surround us with your love. So often we don't stop. So often we're too busy. So often we turn down the invitation to your presence. We have other things to do. We don't stop. We just march on in our own life, in our own vigor, not in your power, not in your spirit. We ask you to bless us this morning in our lives, where we are, in your great love in Jesus. Amen.